And thank you, everybody, for coming. It is one of my favorite topics. I can get off on many tangents, I'll warn you, and thank you to all those who have signed up and you're watching online. So to begin, I use this slide because, you know, this man who 1864 to 1922, for a long time, because he arrived here in 1884 as an 18-year-old, I thought, you know, he did so much when he was here. I really just need to focus on the British Columbia side of his life. It was just so full. We all have childhoods, we're born somewhere, and that's important. But it seemed like such a big undertaking to delve into that. I thought, just British Columbia is enough. Until I really got pushed into diving down the Shetland hole where he grew up, and that opened a whole world to me. I realized how important it is to look at where one is born and where one is raised, and it is an important part of his life. So this particular slide to me represents the two sides of him, the Shetland side and the British Columbia side, and there's a lot of parallels between the two. Despite the distance. And I think the outfits even speak to that, because he was, Shetland, I discovered it meant so much to him. And he's in his Shetland attire, which is so much about sheep and so much about knitting and so much about women knitting. So he's in the Shetland outfit. And on the other side, it's about buckskin and it's about hunting and interior BC, as are the two places that I've mentioned. Shetland out there with the so far out in the North Sea, so far from the rest of mainland UK, and Spences Bridge, you know, we marked there. It was a very, very important community in so many ways. So the slide is important, as is at the bottom of that slide, there are two spellings of his name. When he was in Shetland, he spelled his name Teit, T-A-I-T. Big change when he came to British Columbia to change to T-E-I-T to represent a part of his deep Shetland heritage, which was very anti-Scotland, anti-UK. They really felt they were their own entity that had more in common with Scandinavia than they did with the UK. So he and some of his colleagues who were in high school, growing up in the 1870s, were tracing their surnames and their family histories back to Scandinavian roots. And he found his in that spelling. So when he came here, he changed the spelling to reflect that. So it's an important part of who he was. Now I'm pressing here to, Denny, what's not moving here? So, oh, maybe I do it here. Do I go here? Yes, okay, I see where I'm going. So one of the things that I have been chasing this individual for many decades. And one of the things that caught my attention was, how could someone who is so well published, and we've got here his basketry monograph at the top, 1930, his major monographs on, to use the archaic names, the Shuswap you see there, 1909, the Thompson Indians in 1900, the Lillooet, 1906, it goes on and on. How could somebody like this be so little known? I really couldn't find him much, even as an ethnographer. I couldn't find him really in the histories of American anthropology. And yet, so it still boggles my mind that somebody who's so well published could be so little known. That is something that sent me down the book trail. So because many of you are botanists, birders, I thought that I would highlight something, just dig around a little bit in preparation for this talk, on his work as a botanist. He was passionate about this side of his life. You'll see when I talk about the various aspects of his work that took me down so many years to cover. I actually sort of thought this side, and also just a major work on just wildlife in general in British Columbia. I thought, this is too much. I'm going to leave that to someone else. In the botany, I'm not a botanist, and I didn't do much there. But nevertheless, I thought I'd just share a little bit about what I found this last few days of digging around. which speaks to a man who I think still is sort of undervalued and maybe underrepresented. So this is his ethnobotany of the Thompson Indians. It came out after his death. And obviously it's a new imprint I've got here. Very important work, but it came out in about 1930, 8 years after his death. And for some reason, it ended up with Elsie Steedman, who did the editing of Teit's notes. Her name went forward with this monograph, and as you see, with notes by James Teit. I was thinking, now, how did this happen? It happened with a number of his publications. I was so happy to see Teit's wife. This is his second wife. I'll talk a little bit about his first wife. But anyway, she wrote to Boaz, Franz Boaz, who is overseeing the publication of these monographs. And she said it for me, and I used it in my book. Perhaps I was expecting too much, but I am disappointed with his ethnobotany of the Thompson Indians, which is instead indexed by Elsie Vialt Steedman. So she was quite concerned that this major work that Teit had done had somehow come out under someone else's name. So Teit began collecting. He arrived when he was 18 in Spences Bridge in 1884. And very shortly after that, there was a lot of, he was doing inventories of a lot of things, but plants was one of them. He met John Davidson, who Ryan talked a little bit about, very early on, at least by 1914, they were collaborating. Davidson came here from Scotland, Aberdeen, in 1911 as the provincial botanist. I was curious about him because, as you see with Teit, he went to school in Shetland until he was 16, and that was it for formal schooling. Same with Davidson. Davidson really learned his botany on the ground and didn't, working class family, and didn't get to university, but was really well versed in botany. Ended up here in 1911, was the first provincial botanist until 1916 when he got an appointment at UBC. And that ended in something like 1945. And he lived here in Kerrisdale till 1970. So the two men had a very interesting correspondence. And I just found these little pieces from UBC's collection of his notes and things. But anyway, so he did some botanizing, major botanizing with Teit, but Teit also sent him many specimens. This is not too clear, but Davidson, this is at Spences Bridge, and Davidson is on the left. In the middle is a cook, and on the other side, no, Teit is in the middle. On the other side is the cook. And I thought you might sort of enjoy what Teit sort of wrote to in advance of this trip. Well, first of all, they had a great correspondence about complaining about the attitude in British Columbia to botany, and that it really wasn't being valued by the government, of course. And they actually said, in this country, a lawyer that knows nothing of farming makes laws for regulating agriculture. This is Teit talking. A storekeeper or hardware man makes laws governing fishing, and so on. Besides all that, the main aim of most of them is to prefer all kinds of schemes, good or bad, if they think there is immediate money in it, and then just think of all the crookedness and the graft. And what about a professional politician? Why should there be any such? Well, this is enough. Anyway, they were complaining constantly. But for a trip like this, it's really interesting to see what Teit said. If you want full comfort and accommodation as far as possible to have it on a trip of this kind, it will cost you $11 per day. For this sum, I will furnish everything required, all the cooking outfit, all the camp outfits such as tents, tarpaulins, axes, etc., all the provisions and food, blankets and bedding, 3 pack horses and 1 saddle horse, saddles and equipment for horses, 1 man to cook, help pack, and watch the horses. So I will be able to accompany you around my own services. By doing away with the cook and a saddle horse, you might be able to do the trip for $8 a day, and by further elimination for even $7, but it would not be nearly as convenient nor comfortable. Having the horses with us can keep us shifting from one good spot to another. There's one other way of doing it, and that is to get the Indians or others to shift us up there and then come after us on a certain date. But this way we would have to remain stuck in one place the whole time, and you would not be able to send out any specimens during the time we were out. It would be cheaper doing it this way, but not very much. Anyway, you can let me know what you want. Davidson seemed to want to do it on foot. So a nice little, this is Davidson's on this trip. This is botanizing. They're botanizing, I think, in the Botany Valley there. And this is the cook and Teit. And this is where I found it kind of interesting. So you're able to get to these wonderful digital images of the collections. And I thought, oh, there will be and this is the herbarium here at UBC in the zoology department. I thought, this is wonderful. I've never really done this. And I've sent lots of people because I know that there's lots of Teit stuff there. But guess what? I found all of it under Davidson's name completely. So Teit is missing entirely. I wonder if we can do something about this, because what you can do is go into Davidson's journals, go into the correspondence, and you can see exactly when they're together, and you can see exactly what they were collecting. So these are images, there are thousands of them, of what you can find there, including Davidson's field journals and his maps of where they went and his jottings of what they're finding, and just a rich array of stuff. But again, no mention of Teit. And it goes on because there's some major research that Teit is encouraging on Douglas fir sugar, and it leads to a publication. And I found a letter from Sapir, who was writing to one of the senior scientists in Ottawa, saying, don't you think that, I've just heard from Teit, he's not even got the article. Don't you think that since Teit is the one who instigated this major study of the Douglas fir sugar, don't you think that maybe you could send him a copy? So, it's an interesting case of being overlooked. So Teit himself actually wrote to Sapir in 1918 in Ottawa, an ethnographer, linguist in Ottawa, in 1918, to say that he really felt that his work, and he wasn't someone to brag or to go on about his achievements, quite the opposite, but he actually wrote to Sapir in 1918. He said that he had studied one of the leading ethnobotanists of the day, who was this man who I managed to find, Ralph Chamberlain, who had done major work in Utah with Indigenous peoples there, and had done what was considered a pretty state-of-the-art in 1911 ethnobotany, that's interviewing the local people about the plants. And Teit said, I've really felt that I've surpassed it. I've got between 500 and 600 Indian names of plants in botanical terms, and we'll get more. So the work that he did, and it looks so, inventories of plants known by local people. It requires knowledge of the language. It requires a very close and intimate relationship with women, because they're the ones you really are out there with, you're having to spend time with. And it's a lot of work to actually figure out what the plants are, how they're being used, how they're being cooked, how they're being stored, how they're being stored. And that was just a major work. So I would say it's not in my book. It still remains to be done. And we're lucky we've got Nancy Turner, who has really worked major work with Teit's notes in her own follow-up research on some of the same areas. This is not very clear, but just a little note on the sidebar. It's not very clear, but just you can see Teit's jottings on plants. It's called Names of Plants by the Nlaka'pamux, or the Thompson. And on the other side, you can sort of see Elsie Steedman's editorial work of these notes. To me, it needs to be, I'd love to see it done and really linked to the women, and really linked to the notes, and how could one do it today? And I love what sort of survives of his daily diaries, just because you can see the side of the man who doesn't seem to miss anything. So this is 1910. He's living above Spences Bridge on a 70-acre ranch with his, actually he's living elsewhere as well, all around Spences Bridge, but he's up in the and with the family who lives just north of, in-law family who lives just north of Spences Bridge. But you can see him, he's pruning trees, but he's noticing like blackbirds are arriving, currants in bloom, still pruning, peaches and apricots in bloom, April 9th, plums in bloom, service berries in bloom, finished potatoes, and I even love seeing eat first rhubarb on April 21st, pruning, mourning doves arise. So you can see, he's paying attention to everything around him in the course of keeping a personal diary. So now I'm really getting to who is this guy and why is he so captivating? There's just so much about him. It's hard to cover even in a talk like this. I decided that he deserved a book. Even I had no idea it would take me as long as it did. And with the help from Michael, my partner who's sitting over there, came up with a title that seemed to fit really well. Spences Bridge, known locally as the Bridge, he really did, when you see the full spectrum of his life, he was a bridge. He was such a connector between the Indigenous world and the non-Indigenous world. And anyway, the bridge really worked for us. And, the bridge was a staple of that community. I've got the 1864 version there. And I loved the cover because he was just happy on his horse. And I like often starting with talks like this with, the tribute that Peter Kelly, who was a local, really important politician. There needs to be a book about Peter. There is kind of a book, but there needs to be more about these early leaders. Peter Kelly was one, and he and Teit worked closely together on the land question, on conscription of Indigenous people in the First World War, which they were totally against. And after Teit died, he was in Ottawa making this really moving speech, and this just sort of sums him up. Our esteemed friend, one who has found a warm place in the heart of every Indian in the province, has passed away. J.A. Teit was not just a friend, he was a brother of the Indians of this province. He had their utmost confidence. He had their implicit trust. He was looked to not as a white man, not as a sojourner among the Indians of this province, but one of them, one who could present their views perhaps better than any other man of the present generation, coming from a really esteemed Haida leader in 1923. It just speaks so beautifully to who he was. So back to Shetland, I'm jumping around, I'm taking you back to his roots. You can see there from this map, I like this one, just how far Shetland is from the northern tip of Scotland and how close it really is to Norway. And this, when you see the blow up of Shetland, it's just a cluster of tiny little islands. It's a long trip to get there. It's 12 hours on a ferry. So you really are removed. And you really feel the remoteness when you're there in the most amazing way. Actually, there's just such a network of community feelings and families. And to this day, the landscape, I just, this still, it's just shocking to me that someone who comes, when you go there from here, you're just so shocked and amazed by a landscape that's treeless. There's nothing, there are no trees, and there's beaches and rocky cliffs, and this is what it looks like. And somebody who came to this part of the world and adapted to this, that still kind of boggles my mind. So to switch back to Shetland, so he was born on these little islands in 1864, and a really important historical times there. So it's 1870s. So there have been two clearances in the Highlands of Scotland, and they also impacted Shetland. So Tait's father's family had been outer island in the outer part of the outer islands of Fetler. Think of 800 people who had lived there seemingly forever, didn't own their lands. Most were beholden to their landlords, many who were Scottish, who were clearing the land to make way for sheep. So you got cleared and you ended up in Lerwick, and you ended up being basically evicted from your homeland. So these kids who were growing up in the 1870s, and I actually traced it to a school teacher, the impact of a school teacher from Glasgow, who must have made a major impact on them. They were politicized. they revered their dialect, which when you stepped off of the island onto the mainland and you spoke the English that was spoken in Shetland, you were immediately sort of shunned in a way. Oh, you know, it was the lowest form, one of the lower forms of English speaking. These young people growing up in Shetland revered their dialect. It really was, I mean, these islands had been part of Scandinavia, like the Faroe Islands, with their own dialect until the 15th century when they were annexed by Scotland from Denmark. So their language in Shetland was over the centuries very much mixed up with English, but still maintained something of its Norse origins. Faroe still has its own Scandinavian language. Anyway, they revered it. They were more aware of their history than, even going to school, staying in school till age 16 was quite a long time for these kids. So Shetland, I also got into the fact that it was really this history is interesting. Women really important in Shetland. The fishermen's wives were knitters. They sustained their families with their knitting. You never saw this woman on the left is knitting, but look, she's carrying baskets that they made. They're known for their exquisite knitting, which they used to sustain their families. Women were really important in the Shetland economy, and so I like Teit's outfit because it's knitted. But also, this family in the north, I mean, growing up in the 1870s, this was a family that is a generation earlier, but really important. The Edmonston family, they were from the Northern Island once, but they were botanists. They were birders. They wrote some of the most important books on Shetland birds, Shetland plants, Shetland, and Jessie on the right, this is her brother Thomas, who was really an amazing botanist, died when he was 21, sadly. But Jessie was into the local folklore, just the beauty of just Shetland stories. She wrote many, many books about Shetland, and very important. I can see the influence of that family. Anyway, this is a tradition I'm going to skip by because it's got a long story attached, but Teit was really attached to his Shetland books. I make a lot of those books out. I play those books up in chapter 3 because to me, they were just old family books. We all have them, but they were much more than that. These were Shetland contemporaries writing poetry, writing novels in the Shetland dialect, anyway, near and dear to Teit's heart. So he comes to Spences Bridge because he's got an uncle there, his mother's brother, who has landed in Spences Bridge, and he's somehow managed that little white building in the background is his home, and he's got the local, stopping house kind of hotel and trade store. And he sends a letter to the family in Shetland and said, if you've got one of your sons, Teit was the oldest of 10, maybe they'd like to come and work in my store as a bookkeeper. And so Teit answered that message and in 1884 arrived. And that's sort of what it would have looked like when he arrived. These arrows are kind of important because as a clerk in Murray's trade store, we found one of the ledger books from the store, and it was really kind of a revelation to see, oh, there's on Teit's account, there's this woman named Antco buying and charging to his account. Well, this is a local Nlaka'pamux woman. Within 3 years, so he's 18, 19, within 3 years, he and Antco have gotten together. And by 1892, they marry in an Anglican service up in the 12 Valley, and Teit has managed to preempt some land next to her reserve, which is very important. So once she marries him, of course, because of the Indian Act, she loses her status, but by keeping their land, their community next to her, adjacent to her community, he's right next door to her community, plus all of the Spences Bridge Cook's Ferry Band is also her community. So she's a really important person in all of this story. And we have very few photos of her, but this is one that was taken in 1897. And obviously the link to so much going on there in the entire world of her community. But we have a man who arrived in 1884, and by 1894, 10 years later, he seems to be fairly fluent in language. He's starting to document on his own things like personal names. He really felt that the indigenous names, the Nlaka'pamux names of these people in this community were really important. And look, he really felt that the takeover of Shetland by the English culture had removed so much of what he felt was their indigenous past heritage, and so they were busy trying to retrieve their names and their histories and their stories from their deep Scandinavian past and having a hard time. Here he felt, my feeling is he felt he was in it. He was surrounded by it. They had lost their language, but he was in the middle of a language that was vibrant, learned the language, hunted, fished, got into horses, spent the first couple of years up there trapping in central and northern British Columbia, spent a little bit of time in Nanaimo, where there were a lot of Shetlanders, believe it or not, a community of Shetlanders working in the coal mine there. That didn't go over well, quickly got back to Spences Bridge. Anyway, this is too much to talk about, but you can have so much fun with things like a marriage certificate and names of witnesses and Anglican ministers trying to figure out who they really were. And that was just me doing forensics on the marriage certificate, trying to figure out who the witnesses were and finding them and being very excited. And I found there 2 witnesses on this, and very moving. Every document you can find so much. So there's the Twal Valley. You can see there in Antico's Reserve. So this is what the community maps looked like at this time. So you can sort of see these little piecemeal orange spots, which are just, reserves. And this is the full Nlaka'pamux territory, and yet they're reduced to these little orange spots, DIA spots. So up in the Twal Valley, where they just had a terrible fire last summer, this is our only photo. We have Teit actually in the cabin, but we have, there's outbuildings, some of which would have been his. But I'm just showing a few pictures here of this is just Murray Falls, just behind Teit. Anyway, just some photos you can see of how somehow he adapts to this landscape and becomes very comfortable in it. By 1904, he's starting a new life as a guide, a hunting guide in central British Columbia, up, around the Williams Lake, Chilcotin Plateau area. But the favorite place for him at that stage becomes almost like a second home, and it's miles away. You take the steamer up to Wrangell, Alaska, and you head up the Stikine River to Telegraph Creek, and out from there. From 1904, almost every year, he would go up in late August and hang out with the Tahltan who were on his cruise, and became very close to the Tahltan from that area. And so every year it was up in that area till usually October, November. You can see, like, this is Teit taking notes, beautiful handwriting. These are names and relationships and family relationships and community relationships and stories as he's sounding out names and trying his best to document. So the case that I make from age 18 to 28, he was immersing himself in especially Nlaka'pamux culture, language, everything he could. So this was a really important document for me. And when you don't have a camera, what do? You just sketch. Like, I just wonder about the education that these people got, that how when you're 16, you seem to have so many things at your fingertips, beautiful handwriting, cursive writing, which we don't have anymore, do we? But this is 1893, and it's a collection of stories, and it was really important to me because you're going to see in 1894, something happens. Somebody passes through Spences Bridge who is very important. And we tend to give credit to this person for opening this ethnographic world of Teit's. But you can see this is 1893, and he's sitting with an elder. Actually, in this case, there are several elders who would have been in their 80s and 90s, very knowledgeable. Tate's sitting with them, and they're telling stories, like amazing stories about things, their historical events and in their lifetime, really important stories. But in order to do this, you have to understand nobody speaks English. So it looks like a simple, oh, this man's just sat there listening to these stories. No, 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 it would have taken a long time to get to this point. But Tate obviously wanted to. These are personal names that are so important today and easy to, they were being wiped out, because people became, as you can see here, he's got the Indian names, and then down the middle, he's got, Johnny, Charlie, the names that often the missionaries were giving them because the Indian names were sometimes difficult to pronounce. And so you were just getting Joe or Charlie or Mary or Louise. But he made a point of documenting these names. Tetlanitsa is a really, really important one, a chief from one of those Hooks Ferry bands. And there he is, Tetlanitsa. And then Wistanitsa, another chief. These are names like when you start following through them, you can get to know them. Genealogies all through his notes. Genealogies, one got published in the 1930 Okanagan seal monograph. And it's like phenomenal how many hours they sit to figure all of these relationships. And it's just an incredible genealogy, but all through his notes are jottings about, this is so-and-so, her Indian name, this is her husband, this is her mother, this is her aunt, this is her child. And I've got this just because this is his own handwriting of his own family. You can see those are important to him, all these like tracing back with an uncle who ended up in New Zealand, his father's brother. They carried on an amazing correspondence that is so much about family history, about Shetland history, about the importance of getting back as far as you can to sort of see all these family connections. So 1894 was really important. Franz Boas, who's a huge figure in American anthropology, was from Germany originally, ended up in the States, and very ambitious. He was trained as a mathematician, physicist really, but moving as much as he could into more a social science area. Geography was new and anthropology was super new. Anyway, he was sort of morphing into into this new field of geography and anthropology. He had arrived in North America and had a pretty tough time. Small contracts, difficult contracts. I really feel for him because he got some of his biggest first contracts in the early 1880s to really cover the full scope of British Columbia. You can imagine anybody tasked with documenting every language throughout the province, mapping them, collecting artifacts, doing physical anthropology, which at that time was, carrying a heavy suitcase filled with metal tools so you could get, the distance from the head to the chin and the ear to the ear. And anyway, really difficult and complicated and not terribly welcomed research. So we did have a hard time. And he was mostly on more comfortable on the coast. Amazing work with George Hunt, who's Qualla Tlingit. Anyway, he was passing through the interior, trying to fulfill the objectives of this contract work, and he didn't have a permanent job at that time. So he was subsisting really on these small contracts. And he ended up at Spences Bridge, really ready to give up. And it was a good stop for him because somebody sent him over the river to check out John Murray, the uncle. And John Murray immediately said, "You don't want to talk to me. You want to head up that mountain to that 12 Valley and find Jimmy Tate." Well, that was in a meeting of meetings. I mean, Boas could not believe it. This man was exactly what he needed and what he was looking at. Tate said, you want to head out tomorrow morning on horse? I can saddle up a couple of horses for you and we can go off, and took him around. If you want to do measurements, I guess we can do that. So they did some measuring. And Boas then was there for several days and then said, how about you start writing some of the stuff up that you seem to know well? So Tate said, yes, I can do that. Boas came, it was September, came back in December, and he had like 200 pages or something. Couldn't believe it. That was the beginning of a long correspondence and a long relationship. But Boas did really well because by 1896, he ended up with a curatorship at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Perfect job for him. And he was very ambitious and ended up getting a huge research fund, a grant fund from the then president of the museum, Morris Jessup, who actually decided he wanted to really buy into this huge project of Boas's, which is to map the whole of the Pacific Rim, all around, from our part, all around through, Alaska and down through Russia. And he started this out in 1897 with the large funds, and 1897 Boas was back in Spences Bridge and with two assistants, and they couldn't believe what they achieved in Spences Bridge, and that's a huge long story. But a funny part of the story, which I really had fun with in chapter 5 of my book, because Boas was definitely an urbanite, didn't have an easy way with people. And Boas, just as I read it with Davidson, yes, I can outfit you. I can give, we can get the horses, we can eat. Boas said, I really want to do this road trip. And from Spences Bridge up to Soda Creek and across the Chilcotin over to Bellicou, big trip for all of us today with our easy travel. Well, try it in a pack train in June with torrential rain, mosquitoes, sinkholes, rivers that that are raging, so you can only get across by building rafts to get them across and getting them. Anyway, Boas was just distraught. It was just, and it's June, so a lot of people in Indigenous communities are all off picking berries. They're not there. So it was really like, Boaz was like, get me out of this. I just like, and help me end it. It really was something you could see in he ended that trip thinking, this is it. I've got this incredible James Teit who can do everything by mail and send it to me back and forth. Mail service was really great. And he had George Hunt actually waiting at Bellicou. George Hunt was phenomenal. His father was a Hudson Bay man, and his mother was actually Tlingit, and he was married to a high-ranking Kwakwala woman, and really a part of that Fort Rupert community. So he was also a great writer. So the two men with Boas then ended up with a job, not only at the American Museum of Natural History, but that then moved on to Columbia University, where he had the first professorship in anthropology, big job. So he was really based in New York City, but he didn't really have to be here because he had these two men he could just correspond with. And so for any researchers, it's an absolute gold mine. You've got incredible correspondence, almost daily responses to questions, travels, interviews, everything. So it's a delight of this. So Edward Sapir was one of Boas's students who ended up in Ottawa, really an important linguist ethnographer. He ended up in Ottawa at our first, we had an anthropology division of the Geological Survey of Canada and he ended up with the head of this job. And so he drew in Teit as well. So there's a huge correspondent there. So this is a new book that's just come out by a group of important people. Angie Bain, Andrea Laforette, John Hogan, Sarah Mertz, and Andy Palmer. They've taken all of that correspondence that I just mentioned, and they've got it between covers, 2 volumes actually, because it's huge, 1,000-something pages long, and they've transcribed it and annotated. So this is like a really important lens on that amazing correspondence, and that has just come out. So I've got Boas in Fort Rupert, and I just wanted to show a little shot of George Hunt, but just what Boas was doing, which Teit wasn't doing. So Boas was really interested in the old, the ancient, the pre-contact, the uncontaminated, in quotations, Indigenous culture. He really felt that the present day was contaminated. You don't want that. You really want to get at what people remember of the deep past. So you get this photo does really capture it, because you can see here he is dressing up George Hunt's wife, and he wants the backdrop to be black, so you don't get the white picket fence or the Victorian house in the background so that's Boas on the left and Hunt on the right. But the point is that the stories he's collecting, the work that he's doing, is very much focused on retrieving information they felt was dying before it's totally lost. you can see when you read Teit, you see there's never a feeling with Teit that these are dead, decaying, dying people. They are very much alive. Their issues are alive. Their stories today are important for what they say today. Their stories are important because of what they say about they've seen in their lifetime. Sometimes what they saw in their lifetime wasn't that interesting to others who were interested in retrieving stuff from 2 centuries ago. So again, just it strikes me as so important to see what Boaz and Teit accomplished, because Teit would send the documents, the manuscripts to Boaz and answer the questions, and then Boaz would tie it all up and edit it and then publish it, some of it through the American Museum of Natural History, some of it through the Smithsonian, and other sources, and really, really important line of publications. My connection started years ago. We were just talking a little bit through music, which is my first passion as a really young person coming out, trying to figure out what to do. I loved music, and I somehow got into combining my music interests with anthropology and folklore. And I thought, I got to, anyways, long story. Music led me to James Teit. I was spending some time with elders in Victoria, some recordings in 1977, recordings of 1970s elders from the interior. And there were no computers to transcribe them like there are today. You had to listen and get it down. It kind of crazy exercise. But I wanted to meet the singers. I got to meet the singers, and from the 1970s. And then I started thinking, well, I wonder if there are any other recordings. Well, can you imagine how I felt when I started digging around, and I felt that this man, James Teit, who I didn't know any at all, had recorded over 200 songs in between 1912 and 1920. And with Boaz, there was a collection from 1897 of 44 songs recorded at Spences Bridge. That is such an early collection. But when I got to hear this collection, which was in Ottawa at the time, because it was done through Edward Spear, the recording, it was done in Spences Bridge. They had one of those wax cylinder recording machines there. People dropped in. There was buddies of pals, and they came and they sang. And these were handwritten notes for every song with the name of the singer, often her community affiliation, her Indian name, of course, and the translation of that name, and photographs of people who were singing. And I would say might have been 30 singers, and half of them or more were women. I was just, there was just so much from women that we weren't seeing from any of the early ethnography. There were a few, male ethnographers wandering around doing work at the time. How often, though, were they ever making any contact with women? None. It was often a single man that they found that they could work with. Teit was working with, like, Antco and her whole community of women. And this was a lullaby cradle song. These were the women that I was spending time with. And I had these were singers. These ones are from the head of the Lake Okanagan Reserve, and they when I turned up in their community with these copies of these recordings of these old singers from 1912 and 1915, who were singing songs that they knew, that their parents knew, that their aunties knew, and I had photographs and I had notes. It was just like an amazing experience. So there were lots of photos. These are Boaz's photos from 1897. He's very austere. And he published the photos of these people the photos that were taken in 1897. And it's funny because, no names in the publication, but you can go through Teit's names, and just a revelation so important to be able to say, oh, we can go through Teit and we can figure out who these people are. Teit took hundreds of photos. I get the feeling with Teit that people in the community, especially the women, thought, I want some family photos like we all do. So they turn up in large numbers. He's not a great photographer, but you can sort of see the vibe. It's a lot of women with their kids, a lot of smiling, a lot of comfort level with these photos, which they then all got prints of. But it's so great because they're all named. People in the community today can go back and see these people, and I'm taking too long here, I'm sure, but some of them, all of them have connections and all of them have stories. This was a story that was meaningful to me because this was Hilda Austin on the right, who is one of the lucky people as a little child who didn't go to residential school. Sad because her mother and father both died in the 1918 flu. But her grandmother, Chapelle, who was well-known Indian doctor, unbelievably sounds like a neat person from near Spences Bridge. She took the two little grandchildren and she took them up into the back hills where she trapped and she lived, and she kept them away from residential schools. So Hilda and her sister had the advantage of being educated by their grandmother, and she was one of the most knowledgeable people that I have encountered, Hilda. And that's Hilda's daughter, Sharon, who was raised by her mother, who is one of the great knowledge keepers in Lytton today. But this was so important. She'd never seen a photo of her mother. And we dug out from Teit a photo of her mother with Hilda over there on the right, as a little toddler sitting in her mother's lap. Like, what an amazing experience that was, just what these photos do for people. And she's also on the recordings. So each photo does this. This is just what the jottings look like for family histories in the notes, which are mostly in Philadelphia. That's a long story. Boaz is complete corpus of field notes and journals and maps all ended up mostly in Philadelphia, and it's easy to get access to them if you're interested. There's work on ethnobotany, which I've mentioned, tons of work with women, baskets, buckskin. I actually like this one because, the curators did not want woolens. Are you kidding? The woolens are tarnished. They're contaminated. We want buckskin. We don't want any sign of sewing machines. Well, they all had sewing machines and they were all making their clothes. But anyway, the women were, and when Boaz first wanted stuff, Teit wrote back and said, they really don't have a lot of excess stuff around. Maybe some moccasins and gloves. And then just very shortly after that, he said, well, Teit wrote back and said, maybe they do. And I often wonder if it was Andrew saying, if they want stuff, we can get them stuff. And so it's when I go through the collections, I love sort of seeing the response of the women. That you have to look at those collections. And before Teit knew it, he had more people lined up at his door with stuff, which he gave them good money for. And Teit, you can see him saying to boys, if you want baskets, you got to pay for them, the lots. So lots of baskets, lots of buckskin, but the woolens are kind of fun because, they're doing that too. And how about the woolen sock? Would someone, a collector, this has ended up, the woolen sock is part of the Teit collection in Boston. When Teit went home only once in 1902, he actually went out to the Fair Islands off the coast of Shetland where the knitting was really amazing. Came back with knitting from the window. They were making their own dyes. They were really intricate, amazing knitters. And this came back with this, which he left at the American Museum of Natural History. Place names, which are so important, maps, which are so important. And who is paying attention to the overwriting of the maps, the DIA maps, which are writing Indians out. He was writing them in. This is what you find at the opening pages of the monographs, which are just, place name after place name after place name, and maps, which are so important today. Really important. I'm not even touching on this. I didn't go into it much, but a huge correspondence, as I mentioned, with John Davidson, but another huge correspondence with Brian Williams, who was the first game warden, also provincial game warden. And that is a huge one I didn't tackle. I still don't understand the dynamics totally of big game hunting. And anyway, the correspondence is rich and it's important, trying to get a handle on how do you deal with the overkill and getting, Teit was very much behind getting affidavits from guides before they went and to make sure they weren't taking more than they should, arguing for arguing with the Tarleton that they should be striking to get more higher pay from some of the other guys. Anyway, interesting back. I didn't go down that rabbit hole myself. The Indian rights activism of that era, Teit jumped in with a vengeance in 1908 when the chiefs came to him to write a petition. That petition, handwritten, signed by all the chiefs, X their names, handwritten, really important. It's called Prayer of Indian Chiefs. And you go through that today, and it could have been written today. I mean, the big major gripe was with their Indian agent, who they really despised. But, but can we have better? Can we have our own schools? Our own day schools? Can we have better health care? Can we have doctors who care about us? It's just a really poignant document. That's 1908, and that was the beginning. In 1909, the 1909, there was lots going on in northern British Columbia. The Nisga'a Land Committee was organizing on a really important level. The Cowichan were putting together a really important petition in 1909 to the Indian Rights Association. I love that name. The interior chiefs called themselves the interior tribes of BC. I wish they had a little more heft like the Indian Rights Association, but anyway, the interior tribes of BC. So those three organizations are really important from 1909 on. It's a really important chapter that sort of culminates in Ottawa after Tait's death in 1927. Too much to talk about here, but so important. Spent ages, 2 chapters of my book. I barely sort of like cover it, but I really feel that that is so important chapter of our British Columbia political history. Those chiefs, here they are, the ones that were really working closely with Teit in the interior. They are all important, really important. Tetlanite's up there in the second in next to Teit on the top row, as I say, really important. He died in 1918 tragically. The trips that they had to organize and pay for in 1912, they thought in 1912 there was some hope because in 1911, because Laurier seemed to want to sort of work with them and help them and maybe do something, but they were defeated in Laurier's government was defeated, and Charles Borden became, and conservatives, and they were just a very difficult government to work with, as well as Richard McBride, provincial government here. It was just, they were stonewalled. It's just, it's a tragic piece, but to see the trips that were mounted in 1912, when you've got Teit writing to Spear in Ottawa, it's like, what are we going to do? Like, the hotels won't take us because we're, a group of chiefs. They won't take us. I mean, so they had to sort of organize beforehand to see if they could find accommodation. They had to raise money. 1916, they went again. In 1920, they were there for weeks. These were their major fundraising campaigns to get there. Major documents, petitions, letters that are just so important today, all signed by the various chiefs involved. Here we've got Andy Paul and Peter Kelly. This was, the documents in Ottawa, press releases, meetings with prime ministers, meetings with DIA, Duncan Campbell Scott, who, the head of Indian Affairs, was a very difficult person to work to deal with. But these are chiefs I really feel we need to, who are working so hard. These are the guys I was just mentioning. Laurier, who might have been able to help, but Robert Borden, I said Charles, Robert Borden, and Duncan Campbell Scott. I haven't somehow written over his name over there on the right. Meetings that look like this in Kamloops. Lots of them, Ottawa 1920, just there they all are. So it's all really, for me, the ethnography was like a big part of it. The political activism was another big part of it. And somehow even looking at the political activism, which was sort of daily struggle, and the ethnography, which then becomes kind of daily struggle, and then these trips up north, incredible. I think he had rheumatoid arthritis. He had a detached retina. There's often, like he can barely move. I think it's 1915. 1912 or 1915, barely move. He's so taken down by, he had typhoid, barely recovered from that. Despite it, he's constantly. Anyway, I like always to end with things like, with this particular one, as I say, Chief John Tetlanitsa from Spences Bridge needs to be a household name. And, in Ottawa in 1916, they're there and they're having such a rough time. But I mentioned Edward Sapir, who was in Ottawa, linguist, ethnographer, who sort of offered them, when you're having a really tough time, you're having a tough time, come on over here to the museum, which was very close to the center block of the Parliament buildings. And they did go over it. They sang songs, the chiefs who were there, and they recorded them. And, things like this document, which is Chief Tetlanitsa talking about what land tenure really means in his community. And the whole document, which he's doing in his own language, Tetlanitsa doesn't speak English. So this had to be done with Teit very closely back and forth, but there's no reference to DIA. There's no reference to Indian Reserve 2023. It's all by families and heads of families. I was really excited because one of the heads of families was a woman. So, we tend to sort of think these were male hierarchies. Well, it was so family oriented. And it was like just I like to think of it as Tetlanitsa finding release in this situation where he can actually talk freely and not have to sort of dress up in a suit with tight shoes and to make his case in his language with Teit translating to try to sort of say, these are our lands. This is why they are our lands. This is why they mean so much to us. This is why these songs we're singing are important, because they are our connections to this land. And to actually narrate the documents like this, they are so important. I often wonder, were they doing it? Was Teit doing it? Were they doing it because they could maybe see into the future, and they could see that maybe someday somebody will listen, and maybe someday they knew that this important documentation of life and living in an Indigenous world would be important. Did they have the foresight? I mean, we'll never know. But I really get the feeling that John Tetlanitsa, when he was sitting there doing this work with Teit, so much work, stories, botany, and I even when I come back to botany, I really encourage people to read even Elsie Stevens' version of it, because I was thinking, okay, you know what? I hadn't really studied this, but every time I pick up a piece of Teit writing from any of these documents, I find a golden nugget. And he said, names of plants sometimes originated from a belief in their relationship to each other. The Thompson believed relationship to be based upon association in a locality, just as members of a village community living together were related. They were considered as comrades. These are plants. Or life neighbors living in the same place in the same way. I don't know, that just sort of really got to me. I mean, this is a person who picked up on that. And I really don't think in 1900, certainly from 1884 to he died sadly in 1922, still on the road slogging for this, this land, over this land question. I really don't think there were many at that stage of our history, non-Indigenous people who were taking note and really wanting to be and behaving, as comrades in a campaign that was meaningful. So on that note, I'll say thank you for listening.